Okay, so I'm going to go over some information that will help you with the final project. So far in this course, so all we've been doing is basically taking data, taking summarized data and creating information from it. Most of the time, you don't have that summary available to you, or a lot of the times you don't, I should say. So for our final project, we're going to work with a data set and turn that data set into all of our income statement, balance sheet, etc. So let's go through a little bit how to do that. So I've got just a made up data set here that has about 7,400 rows of data in it. Okay, so the first thing with any data set is you want to try to understand what it contains. Now, if you're working in a data set at an organization you work in, you'll probably already know what your data contains, but obviously you don't know the data that you're going to get in this final project, and so we need to explore a little bit. There are two ways that you can explore pretty quickly, and they are filters and pivot tables. So we're going to go over those quickly first, and then we'll get into how to do some of the problems. Okay, so filter, first thing is anytime you're in a spreadsheet software, as long as you're selected in the data, it will select until there's a break in the data. Okay, so we're selected in our data here. If we go to the data tab, we can create a filter. So notice when we did that, it highlighted our full data set. And we can scroll down to see how far it's highlighted. So it has our full data set, and you'll notice that it has these little green arrows at the top now. So those green arrows let us see what that field contains. So under the account, we have assets, operating expenses, payroll expenses, and revenue. Okay. Under the activity date, you can see we have thousands of dates, or I guess hundreds of dates, maybe thousands because they have a timestamp on them. Under the description, we have a few more titles, amounts. So this is an important piece. Notice our amount starts with 1 cent. Our data, anytime you're using a filter, it organizes your data smallest to largest in the filter dialog box, not in the spreadsheet itself, but in the filter dialog box. So we don't have any negative numbers here. Okay, then we have an indicator of debit or credit, which we should fully understand by now. Okay, so there's one way to look at your data. And here's another way, which I actually prefer. You're going to do the same thing, select your data, go to the data tab and select pivot table. Okay, it'll automatically detect your range for you. And you can put it into a new sheet or into the sheet that we're currently in. I'm going to leave it as a new sheet for this. I'm going to hit create. Okay, so what a pivot table does is it creates this summary that we can build interacting with this editor over here on the right-hand side. So this is a really quick, pretty simple and fast way to organize and understand your data. So let's kind of go through the same way we did with our filters. First thing we did was we looked at accounts. So in a pivot table, I want to add rows for account. Okay, so we have our 4 accounts, just like we saw in our example over here. I'm not going to put the dates in here because what would happen is the dates would give you a date for every, one line for every date that you have. So I'm going to skip that part. I'm going to add the description. Okay, so if we add the description, and we also have the account in here, it tells us what description exists for every account. So it's kind of nice to see how our data is organized a little bit. And you can reorder this. So this is going to look pretty, but if I decide I want the description first, I can just click and drag, and it will reorder my table over here to have description and then the account. Okay, but that doesn't look as good, so I'm going to put the account back up there. Okay, let's go back here. So the next thing, we have our amount and our indicator. So an amount, just like the date, if I put the amount in the rows, it's going to give me one row for every individual amount, which we don't really want. But we do have this values box here, and so I think that is a better spot for our amount. So I'm going to add a value for amount. And when you do that, you can summarize by different things. So if I select this box, here are all the different ways that I can summarize the amount. And it defaults to sum, which is okay, that's what I want. So I'll leave it there. Oh, one thing I should say, when I'm clicked in this pivot table, I get an editor. If I click outside of the pivot table, my editor goes away, okay? Something to keep in mind. It doesn't disappear, it just goes away. Okay, so now I have the amounts in here, and the final thing is our indicator. So I'm going to add the indicator to the columns. So I'm going to add a column for indicator. And now what this is telling me is that I have a sum of credits under equipment of 2.5 million. And I have a sum of debits under equipment of 3.2 million. And so if I want to know what my equipment asset value is, it will be my debits minus my credits. So my equipment asset value is 682,953. And I could go all the way down this list to get that information. Okay, so this is, like I said, a really quick way to understand and organize your data, and you can kind of use it as a sanity check to make sure you're doing your formulas right that we will go over now. Okay, so as you saw in our pivot table, all of our values are positive and we have debits and credits. But we probably want to have our values for what we're doing not be absolute values, but if an asset has a debit like this, we would like that to be negative to show that it's a decrease to our asset account, and then we can just do a total and get our total of debits and credits. So we have our 4 different accounts. Assets, operating expenses, and payroll expenses all increase with a debit and decrease with a credit. And we have our revenue account, which increases with a credit and decreases with a debit. So this formula that we're going to write is dependent on our different account types. That's why I have a value simple and a value complex. Okay, so let's start by that. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort A to Z to make sure that our order is the way we want it. A to Z would just put assets, operating, payroll, and revenue in that order so that I can change the formula once I get to revenue. Okay, so the simple value, we're going to do an if statement here. Okay, so when you type equals and start typing if, just like sum, it gives you this dialog pop-up. So we're going to select if. And this kind of walks us through what we're going to do. So notice that it's grayed out some sections, and this section is highlighted. So what we need to do first is build a logical expression, and it has to equate to true or false. Okay? So what I want to say is if that is equal to a debit. Okay, because I'm dealing with an asset account, I'm going to use debit. So if that is a debit, I want to have the amount. Let me go back a little bit. Okay, so if this evaluates to true, is E2 equal to debit, which in this case it's not, it's false. But if that evaluates to true, then I go to my value if true, and I go to my next portion of the expression by putting a comma. I'm going to put a comma, and you'll notice that now this is grayed out, and this is kind kind of pops out at us. So if that is true, if my logical expression is true, I want an absolute value amount. Because with an asset account, a debit will increase, so a debit will be positive. If it's false, I want the opposite. So I want a negative amount. Okay, so for equipment, let's look at this. If E2 is equal to a debit, that's false, so it's going to go to our false evaluator. If I drag this down, this one's positive, because if E3 is equal to a debit, which it is, then I just want the amount. Okay, so this gets us to our, takes us away from an absolute value and gives us a value based on our debits and credits. All right, let's scroll down here until we find our revenue. Okay, so revenue now is going to be the opposite. Okay, so I copied my formula all the way down, but now instead of a debit being positive, we want a credit to be positive. Okay, so we're going to change the formula, redo that. Guess it's not going to work for us. That will take forever, so I'm going to just copy and paste. By the way, the shortcut key, so what I did there was I went from kind of the top here to the bottom, and if you hold Control and hold Shift and arrow down, so I hold Control, I hold Shift, and I press the down arrow on my keyboard, it will highlight to the bottom of my range. If you have a Mac, that is Command Shift. Okay, so now I have a value based on the debit or credit. Okay, so if I come back to my pivot table and in the amount, I add a value simple to the amount. It's kind of complicated, but notice I get the same numbers. Okay, so that's good. One's just positive and one's negative. We probably need to expand that a little bit so you can see. Okay, so the sum of amount, which is the absolute value, is all positive, and the sum of the value simple is just the opposite if it is a debit in this credit scenario. Okay, same thing for the debit. So it looks like our formula worked because that totals to 0. Totals to 0, totals to 0, totals to 0. Okay, so it looks like that's right because all of our accounts that increase with a debit decrease with a credit. Since this is our credit section right here, we can quickly see that our formula worked the way we wanted it to. Okay, so now let's add a little bit of a complicator here. And instead of having to do 2 formulas and make sure that we're picking the right account for which formula, we're going to have the formula pick our right account. Okay, so we're going to say if we still want a logical expression, but in this case we want more than one logical expression, because what I want to say is if that's a credit and that's a revenue, I want it to be positive. Okay, so I'm going to put an and here, and I'm going to say if that is equal to a credit, and so my logical expression 2, and you can do several expressions in here, and that is equal to revenue. Okay, so a credit for a revenue account is going to be positive. So if both of those things are true, I just want an amount. Okay. My next evaluation, instead of having something simple for if false, I have to do another if statement here. And in this if statement, I want it to be I have two conditions that I need to meet again. Okay, so in this case is if that is equal to a debit, comma, for my next part of my expression, and that is not equal to, so that's what less than greater than sign means, is not equal to revenue. Okay, so if both of those things are true, my indicator is a debit and my account is not revenue, then I want, okay, so if both of those things are true, then I just want the amount as a positive again. Okay, and any other scenario, so you can walk through the scenarios if you'd like, but any other scenario is going to be a negative. Okay, so if we have a credit balance with a revenue account, then it's positive, and we have a debit balance that's not a revenue account, then it's going to be a positive. So our other two options are a debit balance for a revenue account, which will be negative, and a credit balance for a non-revenue account, which will also be negative. So in this case, both of our evaluations will just come to a negative amount. So we don't have to write both of them. We can just say everything else do negative. Okay, and the reason that's helpful is the reason we know that is because we can explore our data with a pivot table, or we can explore our data with our filters. Okay, so now when I do that, copy all of that down. And if I come back to our pivot table, and this is going to get kind of big, but we're going to add a value for the complex. And our complex value should match our simple value every time, okay, which it does. So our simple value, let me expand again. In fact, I'm going to just make this a little smaller. I'm going to get rid of our description. Okay, so now I need to expand again. Okay, so our simple value and our complex value match with credits, and they match with debits. And if we go look at every one in between, they match. Okay, so a simple value, we have to go find the account, and we have to change our formula based on the account. And in our complex formula, so again, simple formula, just one if statement. Complex is going to be an if statement combined with an and statement with another if and statement included. Okay, so this is a little more complex, but it covers this part for us. So there are your two different types of formulas to get a value. So if we go back to our final project, you're going to need to calculate a value for your final project. That value is important because it's going to relate to an account total that I will show you how to do in a minute, and an account total by month. Okay, so getting this value correct is important. This month is just an intermediary step. So I'm going to add month here, and I'm going to redo. So right now, my month is outside of my filter table, and I want it to be included because that can mess up your organization. So if you sort inside of here, this month won't sort with it right now. So I'm just going to turn off the filter, and then I'm going to create a filter again, and it'll include the month this time. Okay, so month is a really simple formula. All we're doing is trying to get a text string out of a date. Okay, so we're going to type text. And this is one of those things that just has a lot of options. So, oh, whoops, I'm in text join. I don't want text join, I just want text. Okay, so we have a lot of options, but our syntax here is we select the number first. And in this case, we want a date, not a number. That's a description for another date, but we'll select our date. And then it's going to ask us what our format is. So there's a whole bunch of format types in Excel. So you kind of have to, or in Sheets, so you kind of have to learn what those format types are. But for us, we want the month. So the month is denoted by MMM. And actually, we don't want the abbreviated month, we want the full month. So we're going to put MMMM. MMMM, yeah, 4. Okay, so that gives us the full month. So what this does is it takes a look at the activity date and says what month is the activity date and return it to me as the name of the month instead of 10, 9, 4, whatever. Okay, so let's copy that down. And cool, so for every transaction now we have the month. Okay, so again, this is an intermediary step that'll help you to do your work. I do not know what happened there. I'm just going to continue as if nothing happened and hope for the best. Okay, I don't know what happened. I just got cut off, but we'll just keep going and you might have 2 videos to watch. Okay, so we need to get totals by year and totals by month in our homework problem. So there's a really simple way to do that with our pivot table. And in this case, we're not using the account, we are using the description. And we don't need all of these different amount types, so we'll use the value complex, and we don't need our indicator anymore because that's in the value part, so I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, so here are our values, and I think that actually, yeah, so our pivot table data was set up before we had the month in here, so we need to adjust our pivot table to include the month. So instead of A1 through G, notice our table goes A1 through H. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to change that to an H. Hit OK. And now I should be able to add the month to the columns. Okay, so if I wanted a total by month, here is my total by month. Now, something to keep in mind is you have to use formulas or you will get your problems wrong. So you either need to interact with a pivot table or do it another way. So I'll show you how to get the pivot table down to that value really quick. Okay, so we can go to filters and let's add a filter for the month. And instead of showing all the months, I only want to show July. Okay, so here is our pivot table for the month of July. So you can do this, but you have to interact with the pivot table. You can't just copy and paste this and put it into this area. So you actually have to interact if you're going to use that method. Okay, the other method, I'm just going to add a sheet, is to use what's called a SUMIF. So I'm going to use my pivot table as a basis for this, and I'm going to take all of those and I'm going to paste them there. So this is total and this is July. Okay, so now I'm going to use a formula to interact with this data instead of using a pivot table, but it'll get me this same result that I have right here. And if I get rid of the month part, it will give me that same result for the month. So now we can get rid of that. Okay, so let's do this. Here we go. We have another formula, and this formula is going to be a sum if. And you can do a sum if or a sum if s in this scenario. I always use a sum if s. Sum if s lets you do more than one criteria. A sum if only lets you do one criteria. And the order is different on the two of those. And so just to be consistent, I always do a sum ifs, even if I have one criteria. Okay? So again, it gives me my syntax, my sum range. So if I go back to my first sheet, the range that I want to sum up, in this case, is going to be value simple or value complex. So I'm going to do the value complex. I'm going to highlight that entire range, and I don't want this to adjust, so I'm going to lock those in by putting dollar signs in front of the rows and columns. Okay, so I'm going to sum column G. I go to my criteria range 1. So my first criteria is going to be the description. So I'm going to highlight the description again. I don't want that to change, so I'm going to lock in my rows and columns. And so my criteria range, I want to sum if something is true. So here's my criteria. And for my criteria, I'm going to go back here, and I want it to be admissions to sum that revenue. And because I'm going to create another formula, I want to lock in my column. I want to stay in column B. Okay, so let's evaluate that. We'll just hit enter, and here is my total for admissions. Okay, and if I go back to my pivot table and I change my filter to all items, 9385 222 26, 9385 222 26. Okay, so we get the same data in both. Now I want to do that same thing, but this time I only want to total the July transactions. So I'm going to do this two different ways. The first way, I'm going to completely redo the formula and start over to walk through it. And the second way, I'll do the simple way. Okay, so in July, we're going to do the same thing, but this time we have more than one criteria because we need to add some admissions for July. Okay, so we have to use a sum ifs in this case. Oh, whoops, I just defaulted to what I had before. So I have to use a sum ifs. So again, the order is the same, so we're going to go to the sum range. And I'm going to use that same value complex. So I select my values. I'm going to lock in my rows and columns. My criteria range 1 is still my description. Okay, so I'm going to lock in cells or rows and columns again. And my criteria again is the same. So same way we did before. I want B to be locked. Okay, oh, I didn't mean to evaluate yet. All right, my second criteria range is going to be the month. Okay, so I'm going to select the month, lock in my rows and columns, come back over here for my criteria 2, and I'm going to, because I can't see it, I'm just going to arrow up. And in this case, I want to lock in row 2 because I don't want row 2 to change. I hit enter, and let's put that into commas, and I have 2071825. Okay, so if we go back to our pivot table, go back to our filter dialog, and oops, let's filter to July. Okay, 2071825. Okay, so cool, we have the same answer for both. So one thing to keep in mind here is we're summing G2 to 7426 and C2 to 7426 and H2 to 7426. So 2 to 7426 has to be constant. If this is G1, I'm going to have a problem with my data set. Okay, so make sure that your ranges are the exact same. You can highlight the totals. So if I set that to G1 and set that to C1 and set that to H1, it'll give me the same answer. You just have to make sure that they're the same. Okay, so now I'm going to do this the simple way. Instead of completely rewriting the formula, I'm just going to take my admissions one. I'm going to copy and paste it. I'm going to come back into the formula, just hit a comma, and that will start my expression. And all I have to do now, because I did everything else in the first one, so I just have to select the month. For some reason, this isn't letting me use shortcut keys, so I'm just going to copy and paste, and that's an H, and that is an H. And now I'm going to select my criteria, which again is back over here. It's July. I want to lock in row 2. Hit enter. If we come back to advertising, 696649. Okay, so we have the same things. Either way you do it out of those two, it's going to work out the same. So I'm going to take those now and I'm going to drag them down. And voila, we have our totals for the month. Okay, so that helps you understand filters, understand pivot tables. We did some if statements here to get a non-absolute value. We did a text formula to get the month. And we did some if-s formulas to get the total for the year and to get the total just for the month of July. And the cool part about referencing this is I don't want July anymore, now I want September. So if I type September there, notice those numbers, and they all change to be September. So that's the cool part about referencing cells like this, is you can just change them to be whatever you want. Okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.